Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick and welcome to Brewing With, a series where we take a look at a new or upcoming X-Wing card and take a look at some ways that we can apply it to the game of X-Wing. We're going to focus on cards that have caused quite a stir when they were revealed based on the comments I've got here on the YouTube channel or indeed on my Facebook page. Now speaking of the Facebook page, if you want to be involved in these conversations, I strongly recommend that you go over there and like it, because what I've been doing is I've been anticipating making these videos and I've actually posted up images of the cards I'm going to make Brewing With videos out of, so you guys can comment and talk about the different kind of builds we can do with these cards. First up, Brewing With Darth Maul, or Maul as he's referred to in the game of X-Wing. He lost the Darth title somewhere during the Clone Wars when he tried to kill Palpatine, but yes, Maul was a big character in the last season of Rebels. Sort of tried to turn Ezra Bridger over to the dark side. There was some really good interplay with those two characters, and indeed that flavour has carried over to his card. Just as a reminder, Maul is a crew card, costs 3 points. Scum only, ignore this restriction if your squad contains Ezra Bridger. When attacking, if you are not stressed, you may receive any number of stress tokens to re-roll that many dice. After performing an attack that hits, you may remove one of your stress tokens. So the general consensus between me and you guys is that first part of the text, when attacking if you are not stressed, you may receive any number of stress tokens to reroll that many attack dice, is not that exciting. Basically for 3 points on the Scum faction, you'd rather just use Dengar. It gives you 1, often 2 rerolls for free, no stress tokens. And this ability alone is not that splashy. What makes this card interesting is the second paragraph, and indeed it's very much new design space for FFG. Removing a stress token directly after an attack is frankly never been done before, and it works differently with lots of different pilots. You can have pilots that already have very efficient attacks and really make the most of that. If you can use push the limits and clear stress turn after turn after turn, there can be a lot of value in this card. The problem is he costs 3 points. And I think we can all agree that first part of the text, as in you can add stress tokens to reroll dice, is probably only really worth 1 point. It's basically an attack dice version of Zuckuss. And indeed he has the same clause as Zuckuss that was added in FAQ, in that you cannot use that ability if you're stressed. And I think if that was the only part of the text, we can pretty much agree that should only be worth 1 point. It's a good boost to your attacks, but it does have a pretty big restriction on it. The second part, however, is where it gets interesting, and I think we could justify spending 2 points on that. All in all, this card costs 3 points, so I think that's fair enough, but 3 points is still a lot. A lot of you have commented, and I completely agree, is if we could get this at a reduced point cost, even just 2 points, only 1 less, and only have that second part of the text, I think this card might just be a bit more applicable overall. But there's no denying that the first and second paragraph actually work really well together, and there's a whole plethora of different options. You have to remember, based on how well a ship flies, whether it takes stress, how efficiently it attacks, there's so many moving parts here that change the power level of Maul. So really, I think if he's going to permeate the meta, we have to try and look at all the different options we have here and work out what's the best way to capitalize on him. Now, there is a whole lot of options here. He can go on any Scum ship or any Rebel ship as long as Ezra Bridger is somewhere in your squad. And Ezra Bridger, as of the time of Maul releasing, will be on 2 different ships. I didn't get that wrong, did I? No, he's not on the TIE Fighter, he's not on the Ghost, so he's on the 2 different Phantoms, and he's also present as a crew card, so your squad must contain 1 of these 3 cards. And given how well Maul actually works with Ezra, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like that's not a tall order, putting him in a Rebel squad, even if the ship he's on is not piloted by Ezra or even crewed by Ezra. I think there's a heap of good options to look at that uses squads that just have it on a completely different ship. But before we look at that, we're going to take a look at the different options we have for the Scum faction. Because ultimately I feel like while Maul could be effective on the Scum faction, he probably has better combos on the Rebel faction, simply because there's lots of different pilots and crew on the Rebel faction that actually play around with that stress mechanic. It's not such a common thing in Scum. So first of all, let's move back to the subject of Dengar. Now obviously in a lot of different situations, Dengar will just be a straight up better card. But there is one glaring omission to this, and this is on the pilot Dengar, because obviously the pilot Dengar cannot take the crew Dengar. So the question is Maul going to be a good crew for Dengar? And I think there's a strong case for this. Given that Maul can bury your ship potentially under a mountain of stress, the Jump Master is very efficient at removing stress. Even though it just lost the astromech slot and it can't take unhinged astromech to make its 3-speed maneuvers green, it still feels like a very strong option. So let's have a look at a basic Dengar build. We have Dengar with Lone Wolf, Maul, Glitterstim, and Punishing One. Lone Wolf, of course, is always a mainstay on Dengar. And when attacking, if you have to reroll just one blank, you don't have to take the stress token, which means Maul's second ability is there to remove a stress if you have it, which is nice and potent. If there are more dice you want to reroll, you can just use Maul's ability then. Indeed, Glitterstim is present, and this may seem counterintuitive. Obviously, you can pop Glitterstim and stress yourself out, which means it's very difficult to use Maul's ability, but remember we also have Lone Wolf. So if we pop Glitterstim at the start of a combat phase, we're often going to get hits off our attacks, meaning the stress we take off of Glitterstim will be removed with Darth Maul. Indeed, Dengar has the ability to shoot twice a turn, if the circumstances allow, so there's always the possibility that you use Glitterstim, you remove the stress off the first attack using Darth Maul, and on the second attack Dengar is stress free to then use Maul again alongside Lone Wolf and Glitterstim, meaning his attack will probably just convert all of the dice, which is pretty good. And this really helps capitalize off that new design space. Removing a stress after you attack is really potent if your ship can attack more than once, because you might be stressed on the first attack but not stressed on the second. And depending on the EPTs you take, that can be really helpful. Now obviously Expertise is a very strong choice on Dengar, but I don't think I'd recommend it here, because using Maul's ability turns off Expertise. And yes, I know you could make the argument, well, you can convert the focus results before you use the rerolls of Darth Maul, but you generally want to reroll before you convert focus results. That mathematically is the soundest way of using rerolls and focus conversions. So I think this build here is what makes the most sense to me. Now, is this categorically better than, say, a Recon Specialist or a K4 Security Droid? I don't know, but considering Maul can remove stress tokens between two attacks, that could have a lot of effect on the game, and it's not worth just turning our nose up and rejecting it straight off. Obviously Recon Spec and K4 Security Droid are proven on Dengar, they work very effectively, but let's not write off this new creative option out of the gate. Now before we move on, Mr. M. Ward, I just want to point out that you were talking about this as well, putting on Maul with a Dengar ship with either Rage or Push the Limits. I'm not super convinced that these are super strong options. I feel like leaving the stress off during the activation phase just makes more sense. If we want to pop the Glitterstim at the start of combat, I think that's probably okay, but anything that adds on stress before Maul gets a chance to activate is potentially going to hurt the build overall. Having said that, I will concede that Push the Limit is a strong option because it only ever adds one stress, and maybe you can use it perfectly just in those instances where you're going to take two attacks, or you're probably going to take two attacks anyway. I just feel overall that's probably just a bit too situational and something to be cautious about building. Glitterstim to me as a one-off use just feels like it's doing a bit more in this build than Push the Limits. And speaking of your comments, we had one more person suggesting a Maul build on the Scum faction, and this is from Mr. Bronze Sparrow. Has anyone thought of Maul with 4LOM G1A with push limits, advanced sensors and vectored thrusters? Just too much fun giving stress and making the hit. And this is good. Overall, out of everything in the Scum faction, this is the ship that wants to play with stress the most. And it can actually capitalise off the back of Darth Maul. Now Darth Maul is a 3-cost card. There's always the argument that you just take Zuckuss, and I can completely agree with that. Zuckuss is only 1 point and it's doing as much work with the stress control as Darth Maul. However, Darth Maul can also reduce the amount of stress in your own ship, and that could be a powerful thing. Darth Maul also gives you the option to spend as many stress tokens as you like. Sure, you might be re-rolling dice you don't want to re-roll, but then you can perfectly control the amount of stress tokens on 4LOM and make sure that you're going to be left at the end of your turn with only 1 stress token on him, so you can only pass off 1 and he's completely stress free and he can move on and work the next turn. Again, I'm not so sure about Push the Limits. It turns off Darth Maul's ability. I'd rather have that working turn after turn after turn, so maybe not Push the Limits. I'd probably go for something like Veteran Instincts, just get him up to pilot skill 8, that's really going to help him with his positioning. And instead of vector thrusters, obviously we go for the title instead. You get the same effect for 1 less point, plus you get a tractor beam, which might be relevant here and there, but ultimately it's 1 less point for the same effect. And this is definitely something worth looking at as well, because Darth Maul and 4LOM work well together. It's just about whether Forlom can get his ability working effectively whilst carrying Darth Maul. It's not a straightforward yes or no from me in terms of how effective this is going to be, but it's something worth looking at. Going back over to the previous comment from Mr. M. Ward, another ship we can look at is Bosk, or indeed the YV666 in general, because it can take multiple crew options. And then we have the option of putting on Maul and Inspiring Recruit. This is indeed something we can do on the Rebel faction as well, but to me it just makes a bit more sense on Scum. Now, here you suggested using Rage. Again, I'm not a fan of this because it turns off Maul's primary ability, but I think Maul and Inspiring Recruit alone just makes a lot of sense, and then you could use, like, say, a Crack Shot or another 1-point APT if you're using Bosk. Or you could just go for the Trandoshan Slaver and then use Maul Inspiring Recruit and call it a day. That makes a lot of sense to me. You could even chuck on a Forlom if you wanted to, make sort of a quasi bounty bus kind of build. I don't think it's going to be as effective as the original bounty bus was, but then again, you do get the option of removing stress, and the cool thing about the YV66 is it has a red full stop maneuver. If you somehow manage to stop the ship and hit your attack, you can clear stress and do it again, and again, and again, and again, and your ship does not move. It gets to shoot in place over and over again. Maybe it's wedged between two asteroids, and that makes it very difficult for your opponent to get behind it. That's really cool. The idea that you could full stop a YV666 over and over again is just a great side effect of what Maul's doing here. And again, it harkens back to what I'm talking about with this original design space. Removing a stress after you attack could have a big impact on the game because of the way it changes some ships' fly, and this is another example of how that could be. One more thing I want to bring up before we move on to the Rebels is a ship that I love to fly, and this is Boba Fett on his Fire Spray. And yes, I know, Boba Fett's not a particularly meta or powerful ship, but I really like this pilot. Boba Fett with fearlessness and engine upgrades is always a fun thing, but one of his biggest downfalls is the way he can't deal with stress. Once Boba Fett gets 1 or 2 stress tokens on him, he is done. It takes him ages to turn around, he can be out of the battle for too long, and that can spell doom for your game. And again, we're talking about Darth Maul, and we have the option of removing stress after he hits attacks. And one thing this Boba Fett does beautifully is hit attacks, turn after turn. Sure, they might not be big hits, but if you give yourself a bonus every time you hit an attack, then suddenly Boba Fett can do a lot more things. His dial opens up a bit more, he can breathe a bit more because he has options to remove stress. Sure, your opponent can play around it, but still, forcing your opponent to play around that is still very powerful. It means Boba Fett can theoretically K-turn into the middle of a battle, take his range 1 shot, which he's probably going to hit because he's Boba Fett with fearlessness, that's pretty much a given, remove the stress, and then keep on moving. The problem with Boba Fett is if he does a K-turn, it means he pretty much has to do a 1-2 forward or a 1 bank, and that's not very explosive. This ship has a 3 hard, and often you have to keep throwing at that 3 hard to keep him in the fight. Now suddenly he can do a K-turn and then remove stress for the next turn, potentially doing another K-turn, but more importantly, he can do a 3 hard the next turn and then take his action. And that could be very potent. Now, the issue here is Maul costs 3 points, and that's not ideal. I'd much prefer if Maul was a bit cheaper and just had that second clause. The first part is not that helpful on Boba Fett. However, I'm not unhappy to have that. If Boba Fett's fighting at range 2, he's not having a good time. And Maul gives him the option of having rerolls at range 2. For example, if you roll 2 hits and 1 miss, there's a pretty high probability, depending on the ships you're fighting against, that you're going to be able to remove that stress because 2 hits is going to hit a lot of things. So you may as well spend the extra stress and get the extra reroll. You might get 3 hits out of the deal. If you're fighting against, say, Rear Admiral Shenru, you don't care. Those hits are going through anyway. Why don't you just take that reroll, which is basically free at that point? And this is another thing about Maul which is very interesting. The way those two things interact is, if you have a guaranteed hit based on your result, the reroll is 100% free. And at that point, Maul is potentially doing better than he was before. If you don't want to take that reroll, it means that you're guaranteed to remove that extra stress that your ship might already have. And this is what I'm talking about with this new design space. He's not just straight comparable to Dengar, although I think in many situations Dengar is just better, but if you can exploit Maul, with this dice rolling ability, if you can exploit him to make your ships more efficient, this is where he becomes potentially really explosive, and that's what makes me so excited about this card. Okay, I've been stalling long enough. Let's move on to the Rebel faction. I think this in particular is where Maul is going to see his best builds, because there are ships on the Rebel faction that like to play around with stress. He combos so well with Ezra, either version of Ezra or the crew. It all makes a lot of sense. I will say there is one fundamental problem with putting Maul onto an Ezra piloted ship. That is, Ezra's ship likes to have stress tokens during the entire combat phase, and the issue is he has a relatively low pilot skill. And basically Maul only helps him out if Ezra shoots first, because Ezra can shoot, he can get the stress off Maul's ability, and then use that stress on his defense. The problem is if he has a low pilot skill and your opponent's flying, say, pilot skill 8-9 aces, they're going to shoot Ezra first, and then you're not going to get any benefit out of that defensive ability of the Ezra pilot. For that reason, I think there's a case to say he's probably just better straight up alongside the crew version of Ezra. And the crew version of Ezra costs 3 points, reads Rebel only. When attacking, if you are stressed, you may change one of your eyeball results to crit results. And look, I don't need to explain why that's cool. The only issue is it costs 3 points, and the two of them together cost 6 points. I think there's a case to be made that this is probably just too expensive to go on the same ship. However, it can go on an L-Star gunship, and that attack becomes really explosive. You can put this on Wolf Warrow, and that could be potentially hilarious, because once Wolf Warrow takes enough damage, he's slinging 4 dice every attack. And that is just super explosive. That is so much potential damage. Sure, this alone costs 36 points. You're probably looking at, say, Veteran Instincts to get up to pilot skill 9, makes perfect sense. Maybe chuck on a Vectored Thrusters, then he's up to 39 points. But there's no denying that this ship could do a hell of a lot of damage. I mean, look at that. Look at that attack efficiency. It's just nuts. However, let's be realistic, 39 points might just be pushing it a bit too far, so perhaps we should look at putting Ezra Bridger somewhere else in the squad if we want to fly Maul. So first up, let's have a look at this list, and thank you Lachlan, you suggested this on the Facebook page. This is Ezra Bridger in the new Phantom alongside Lorik, and the way Maul's been used here is we have Lorik with Veteran Instincts up to pilot skill 7, Inspiring Recruit, and Maul. And of course, this harkens back to what I was talking about with Maul being flown alongside Inspiring Recruit. And it makes a lot of sense on Lorik, because Maul's abilities doesn't require any action. So Lorik can get the benefit out of the Maul without getting in the way of his own abilities, which is just always taking reinforced tokens in case you haven't flown him before. And this just makes a lot of sense. I think Maul with Inspiring Recruit is just going to get a lot of efficiency out of Maul. But ultimately in this build, there is no ultimate combo with the way Maul's doing. He doesn't combo with his pilot, he doesn't really combo with anything else in the build, apart from Inspiring Recruit, obviously. However, he himself is just nice and efficient. But why don't we have a look at some builds that actually uses Maul's ability in combo with the pilot ability. And one thing a lot of us have been talking about is Kayan Farlander with Maul, and I think this just makes a whole lot of sense. Kayan Farlander can spend stress tokens in order to convert all the eyeball results to hit results during an attack. So with Maul, you could gain 1 or 2 stress tokens to reroll 1 or 2 dice, spend one of those stress tokens to change all the eyeball results, and then Maul will remove the last stress result if indeed there is one, and that just seems really, really powerful. It looks like on this build, Kayan Farlander is just going to consistently hit with 3 dice every single turn straight up, and also keep shedding all of his stress tokens, which is just nuts if you think about it. Now we had this build here from Ines, which included Ezra Bridger on the Sheath Speed shuttle, but the Kayan Farlander build had Veteran Instincts, Collision Detector, Heavy Laser Cannon, Maul, and B-Wing E2 for 41 points, and that just feels really, really solid. If you want to spend the points on Heavy Laser Cannon, you have a 4 dice attack, and of course, as I just said, the efficiency on that Maul attack is just nuts. I don't know if we really want to be spending 41 points on this. Problem is Kayan Farlander already has a 3 attack dice, and the Heavy Laser Cannon arguably isn't significantly enough better to justify the 7 points, but it is, however, very powerful. And this is just a good solid build for Maul to slip into. We also had this suggested from Nick Vernon, and this had Nora Wexley and Kayan Farlander alongside Fen Rao, of all things. And Nora Wexley has used Ezra Bridger as a crew, which makes a whole lot of sense. With Push the Limits, you can take a target lock off Push the Limits pretty much every single turn, which then of course can make that focus result, which then can be turned into a crit result using Ezra Bridger. Just makes a lot of sense. sense. With Katarn Farlander though, we have a different build. We have Push the Limits, Fire Control Systems, Maul, and the B-Wing E2 for 38 points. And I quite like how we've opted not to use a cannon here. I think it makes a lot of sense. Fire Control Systems means you're getting a lot of efficiency out of that attack. If you don't have to use Maul, it means you can still shed those stress tokens, and that feels cool. Push the Limits, I'm not so sure about. Having said that, if you look at the way this has been built, Push the Limits can be used sparingly. Say on the first attack, you don't want to take Push the Limits, for example, you just want to get those reroll off of Maul. And that means you can use Katarn's ability and Maul's second paragraph to clear all of those stress tokens, and then you get a Fire Control System target lock, and then later on in the game, you can just keep pushing. And because you always have those target locks, you don't really need to worry about using Maul's first paragraph. And I gotta say, I like both of these lists by both Nick and Ines. It just makes a lot of sense. One has a heavy laser cannon, one doesn't. They're both roughly around the same point cost. One has Push the Limits, one has Veteran Instincts, and I think there's a strong case for all of these different variations. It makes a lot of sense to me, and Katarn Farlander to me in particular is going to be the ship on the Rebel faction that's going to get the most benefit out of Maul. Now before we finish up, there's just one more MIDI combination I want to talk about on the Rebel faction, and that is the ability to take Maul alongside Kyle Katarn. Kyle Katarn reads, after you remove a stress token from your ship, you may assign a focus token to your ship. He also costs 3 points. So again, arguably having these guys in the same ship may be very, very expensive, but there's always the possibility that you just want that really ruthless efficiency. And look, this may not be a crazy meta build. I know the new Han doesn't see much play, as in old Han. I actually had a conversation with one of you guys saying, old Han. I'm like, you mean the Han from Wave 2? Like, no, as in the Han that is old from The Force Awakens, which is very confusing. But the old Han, as in the Han from The Force Awakens with Kyle Katarn and Maul, is something that could prove very interesting because it, out of the gate, gives him an amazing attack economy, and it means after he attacks, he's probably going to hit, and he's probably going to get that free focus token. And that could be really, really cool. Indeed, you could take 2 stress tokens out of Darth Maul, clear one of them after the attack, and then clear the second one after you do a green maneuver the next turn, meaning you're getting so much efficiency out of Kyle Katarn. Now, I will admit, I think there's probably better things you could be doing on the Falcon, but once again, I have to bring it back to this, that this is new design space. So when I look at this Darth Maul Kyle Katarn combo, I think, you know what? This probably isn't going to punch through the meta, this probably isn't going to make it into the most high tier lists, but it's another way that we can actually abuse Kyle Katarn even further. He's always been a great crew on the Rebel faction, but now we can clear stress during the activation phase and during the attack phase every turn potentially, which is kind of crazy if you think about it, getting all of those extra focus tokens off Kyle Katarn. And maybe that is just worth spending 6 points on. I don't know, what do you guys think? Answer in the comments. Anyway, I've been waffling on about this card for long enough. It is a super exciting and explosive card, and I really look forward to it. The next one of these videos, I'm going to do an R4TK, because after I made the video a few days ago, you guys just went nuts in the comment section talking about different builds with this. So please, let me know what you think about Darth Maul, suggest any other builds I may have missed here, and also suggest some builds for R4TK, because it's going to be the next video, and it's going to be another long one because there's so many ideas you guys have come up with, and there's so much cool, new, interesting design space that moves into. Anyway guys, thanks for watching, like and subscribe, like the Facebook page, and I will catch you later.